Alia is a leading audience researcher and fundraising strategist for nonprofit causes. With partner Network for Good, she's helping research teams to understand behavioral dynamics and giving. And as a blogger on the topic, she's been a leading voice helping organizations to understand the behavior behind giving. Alia leads projects with Wikimedia Foundation, the operators of Wikipedia, Amnesty International, and Environmental Defense Fund. And she co-created Lifeboat, a movement of people trying to rediscover deep friendships in our sometimes disconnected age. Welcome to Alia McKee.
Thank you so much. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to start with a little story about myself. When I was in my early 20s, I dodged the law school bullet, and I made the only other choice that I thought a liberal arts grad who didn't know what she wanted to do with her life could possibly make. I fled the country. You see, my mom is Cuban, and I grew up speaking fluent Spanish, so I figured I didn't know what the heck I wanted to do here, so I might as well take my talents and energy all the way to the sunny beaches of Venezuela, which is exactly what I did, much to my parents' chagrin. And it was there that I took the first job that was offered to me. I became a translator for Philip Morris. Yes, that Philip Morris, right? And even though I peddled cigarettes for a time in my life, which I'm not proud of, throughout my time in Venezuela, I had a lot of life-changing experiences, and I met some influential peers and mentors, and I became very focused on social change and social justice, something that I really hadn't dug into previously before I lived in Venezuela. And 24 months later, after a lot of volunteer opportunities and a lot of growth, I came back to the United States very much a do-gooder and very much focused on making social change a priority for me. And so, of course, this experience made a lasting impact on me. And in my career as a researcher and a social cause marketer and fundraiser, I've made that kind of transformation a key area of focus, right? How is it that we can harness the energies and passions and motivations of young people and get them to positively impact our nonprofits and get them to create relationships with our nonprofits and then ultimately get them to give and support our nonprofits? And one of the key things that I've learned in my career is that in order to influence behavior, we really need to understand behavior. And in that, we are extraordinarily lucky because in the last several years, there has been a scientific revolution in our understanding of how people behave and make decisions, including decisions about if, when, and how they want to engage with our causes. And in my day-to-day practice, I'm finding that a lot of these lessons apply tenfold to millennials. So here's the Homer slide, right? And one of the biggest lessons from this body of research is that we have something incredibly important, extremely wrong. And I think in the nonprofit sector, this is super troublesome because we like to think of our audiences as rational, logical, Spock-like individuals, right, who are making their decisions based on facts and doing a cost-benefit analysis and making decisions about whether they're going to engage based on that analysis. That's what traditional economists call rational choice theory. But the problem with that is that it's absolutely wrong. People are not like Spock. We are more like Homer Simpson, right? We are limited in attention, we are teeming with impulse, and we are ruled by emotion. But that's not a bad thing, as long as we as marketers and communicators and fundraisers know that we're talking to Homer Simpson and not Spock. Because as you can imagine, trying to get Homer Simpson to make a gift to an organization is a completely different conversation than trying to get Spock to make a gift to an organization. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to share with you 5 other principles from the science of behavior that hopefully can help you understand how to better harness millennials' energy and enthusiasm so you can create relationships with them and ultimately get them to give. And the first lesson I'm going to share with you comes from the field of cultural cognition. Millennials embrace community. So what the heck is cultural cognition? Cultural cognition is a relatively new field of study. And it argues that people make decisions not based on facts, not based on reason, but on the value groups with which they most powerfully identify. Dan Kahan is a professor at Yale, and he started something called the Cultural Cognition Project. And he's boiled down American values into what I like to call the subatomic particles. Now, this is an oversimplification of Kahan's work, but for the purposes of this session, I think it's going to make a lot of sense. So he's boiled it down in the following two lines. On the first lines, you have your communitarians versus your individualists. Your communitarians, as the name suggests, believe in the power of the collective community. Your individualists, as the name also suggests, believe in the power of the individual. And according to Kahan, these are opposing value sets. On the next line, you have your egalitarians versus your hierarchists. Your egalitarians believe in equality and a less rigid and structured society. And your hierarchists embrace structure, and they're looking at a top-down hierarchy to help solve our problems, right? Now, through a bunch of values-based research, scientists are finding that millennials tend to fall into the egalitarian and communitarian value sets, right? So this means that sending them messages that would appeal to individualists or hierarchists aren't going to inspire a majority of millennials. They're looking for messages about joint responsibility, about the power of collective community, about a less rigid status quo, right? It's not that individuals or even institutions are here to solve our problems in the views of these value sets. It's that the community needs to rally to help solve these problems, right? It's not that Alex is going to pick himself up by his bootstraps. The community is going to be there to help him. I think a lot of the transformational progress that we're seeing around equality issues, particularly LGBT equality issues, stems from the fact that we're seeing this shift in values. So when you're crafting messages, when you're crafting marketing campaigns, when you're talking about millennials within your organization, definitely think about values-based marketing as an area of interest. All right, the second principle, millennials care what their peers say. Now, this behavioral economic principle goes across generations. People are evolutionarily programmed to pay attention to each other's social cues. We did it for survival, right? And we're still doing it. Robert Cialdini is a psychologist who argues that social proof is one of the most powerful motivators of behavior out there. He's done a lot of studies, and I'm going to share one with you right now that I think is particularly relevant. So, who's familiar with these hotel placards that are in every hotel room that urge you, please reuse your towel to save the environment? Well, Cialdini wanted to see if he could increase towel reusage by employing this idea of social proof. So he tested 3 messages across a variety of hotel systems, and this is what he found. So message 1, the control, said something like, help us save the environment, please reuse your towel, it helps us save water. The second message deployed this idea of social proof. It said, a majority of guests in this hotel have reused their towel. Will you join them and help save the environment? And then the third message had a deeper connection, albeit a completely arbitrary one. It said, a majority of guests in this room have reused their towel. Will you join them and help save the environment? Well, message 2 had an 18% higher reusage rate than the control. And message 3, that had that arbitrary connection to the room, 33% higher than the control. This idea of social proof is really powerful. And while it does play across generations, it is particularly powerful for millennials. There's a lot of research out there that are showing that they're even more clued in to what their peers are saying. There was a recent study that said 70% of millennials are more excited about an experience or a product when their friends are excited about that experience or product, and that's opposed to 40% of other adults. So this idea is really strong. Now, how can you make this a reality? The first thing, it could be as simple as saying 100 other people in Indianapolis gave to this campaign. Will you give to it? Or you could look at your messengers, right? Your spokespeople. Do you have millennials representing your organization so that way you're showcasing social proof? Or as Derek was talking about with peer-to-peer fundraising, right? Are you using millennials to help raise money on your behalf? Those are ways that you can really sort of inject social proof into your campaigning. All right, principle number 3. Millennials are looking for impact. So let's talk about the intricacies of impact here. There's a psychologist by the name of Paul Slovic who did a really interesting experiment. He split a group into 2, and in both groups, he said that the donations raised would go to help save the lives of 4,500 people by sending clean water to a refugee camp in Rwanda. Now, in group 1, he said there were 11,000 people in the camp. And in group 2, he said there were 100,000 people in the camp. And he found that people were much less likely to give when the camp was bigger, okay? Now, if we were talking to Spock, Spock would say, well, the lives saved in both scenarios remains constant, right? But Homer doesn't see it that way. Homer's like, wait a second, when the camp is bigger, I'm having less impact. So when we're talking about impact, please know that I'm talking about impact that is felt, not necessarily understood. And why is it important for millennials? Guys, this one is big, right? We are in the middle of a transformational shift here. My firm, Sea Change Strategies, is about to release a study on generational giving with Blackbaud. And we found that 60% of millennials say the primary driver of their giving is this idea of seeing impact. That's opposed to 30% of seniors and 37% of baby boomers, right? So seniors and boomers are much more open to the charity that I trust is going to spend my dollars wisely. But the millennials are more like Missouri, right? They want you to show them how the money is making a difference on the ground. And I think innovative nonprofits are really thinking hard about how they can do this. Charity Water has a whole section on their site dedicated to proving it. So that way, when you give a donation to a clean water project, you get the GPS coordinates of that water well via Google and information about the community that you're helping, right? So definitely try to infuse this idea of impact into everything that you're putting out there when you're trying to communicate about philanthropy to millennials. All right, principle 4, millennials don't balk at authority. So this is another one that goes across generations, right? Authority is a primary driver of behavior. Back in the day, we had the Milgram experiments, which showed that people were willing to do things that they thought were morally and ethically wrong simply because an authority figure told them to do it. More recently, researchers, I love this experiment, they had a guy walk across the street into oncoming traffic against a light, and they found that people were 3 times more likely to follow the man when he was dressed in a suit and tie. So it sort of shows you that even like the illusion of authority like sways our behavior. Now, why am I bringing this up in the context of millennials? Well, in my day-to-day practice, I'm finding that the authorities that speak to millennials are different than the authorities that speak to seniors, boomers, and to a lesser extent, Gen Xers. Millennials are wanting to meld that last point about impact with authority. They want to hear about the scientist who wrote the report. They want to hear from the advocate in the field who's working to pass the legislation. They want to hear from the beneficiaries of your organization, right? Older generations are more open to hearing from the VP of philanthropy or the executive director or a prominent member on your board, right? So as you are crafting your bench of spokespeople, please make sure that you're thinking about these credible, on-the-ground authority figures that you can put out there for millennials. And finally, millennials respond to emotion. Chip and Dan Heath are 2 MBAs who specialize in change management, and they believe that the human mind is actually 2 minds, and this is how they envision it. They say 1/2 of the human mind is this emotional mind, and they say the emotional mind is this big, giant elephant. And they said the other half is the rational mind. And the rational mind is that teeny weeny rider who sits on top of the elephant. And they believe in order to get any change to happen, you have to do 3 things. The first thing is you have to spur the elephant. You need to engage emotions. And they say the best way you do this is by giving a relatable story about one person or one individual, right? To really engage and lead with the heart. The second thing you need to do is reassure the rider that the elephant isn't going to buck him off, right? So you can sprinkle in some facts now and then. And then the third thing you need to do is give the rider a clear call to action so he knows where you want him to take this crazy rambling elephant, right? But the problem with nonprofit communications is that we have the ratios and the sequence usually quite wrong, right? We like to lead with facts, and then we might sprinkle in a couple of stories, and then usually we end with a nebulous call to action. But the Heath brothers say, lead with story, then sprinkle in some facts, and then have a very clear call to action. So I'm going to tell you guys a story, the same story, but in both frames. So let's start with traditional nonprofit speak. A fifth of DC residents live in poverty, with 27,000 of those residents living in extreme poverty, meaning they can't afford basic necessities and housing. During the recession of 2008, the number of homeless women and girls in DC rose by 14%. Our organization helps homeless women and girls find housing assistance and basic necessities. You can help, learn more, right? So very traditional, I've read that on a lot of nonprofit About Us pages. Here's how the Heath brothers might tell that story. This is Sally. During the Great Recession of 2008, Sally's mom was laid off from her job and lost her benefits. Because of ongoing health problems, Sally's mom was really struggling to make ends meet. And just last year, she and Sally found themselves homeless. Our organization helped Sally and her mom find a safe place to live. And we gave Sally something she hasn't had in the last 9 months, a bed all to herself, right? We're also helping Sally's mom find a job with good benefits. You can help other children like Sally. Donate now, right? So clear difference. One of those led with the head, talked to Spock. One of those led with the heart and talked to Homer Simpson. And of course, emotions span generations. But you can't ask me to speak about fundraising and engagement and not have me have it one of the core principles, right? In order to be successful at creating relationships, we have to be fearless about leading from our hearts, not our heads. All right, so my time's coming to an end here. But just quickly to recap, the 5 principles. Millennials embrace community. They care what their peers say. They're looking for impact. Remember that one. They are looking for on-the-ground, credible authorities. And finally, 5, they respond to emotion. So if there are 3 things I want you to take from this session today, it's that number 1, in order to influence behavior, we need to understand behavior. The second is that values and emotion trump reason and facts every day of the week. And the third is that there are simple behavioral tools and research and experiments that the academic community is doing all the time that can help us make sense of how we can better engage millennials and all generations in making our world a better place. Thanks, guys, for having me.
We're gonna chat.
All right.
It's so cool, right? So I gotta ask the hard question first, which is that if I'm a 60-year-old, let's say white, let's say male executive, I'm gonna say, how long is this stuff gonna be true?
Absolutely, it's a great question. It's a great question. So for the purposes of engaging millennials today, all of this is accurate. And some of the core principles like social proof and authority, I have a really strong feeling that that's not going to buck the trend. But for some of the values-based pieces, we're going to have to take a look at that longitudinally and see how millennials age and shift. Because as we know, lots of things are dynamic. I'm a Gen Xer, and they said that my generation didn't care.
Clearly you care a lot.
Right, we care a lot. So we really have to watch and see how those things shift.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious actually about the community piece, because one of the criticisms or challenges that people, I think, face with Gen Y, and one of the things I'm really interested in is leadership. So as you look forward, how does a generation that is so focused on these community and consensus-based ideas start to move into a space where they're ready to be leaders on giving? They're ready to set the trends rather than just reflect them, perhaps.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I'm a leader of a community similar to that. It's called Web of Change. And we do everything on a consensus basis. But it's what I love about it is it helps people find their voice, right? It helps them workshop their ideas in a collaborative environment. And through that process, leadership emerges. And so I think it is very possible to have consensus-based leadership. I mean, you need accountability, right? Which is ultimately, you know, there is someone in that community who's ultimately, their ass is on the line. Sorry. You know, but you need that accountability, but I do think it can rise up amongst the community.
Well, you gave us some great examples of ways in which organizations are being creative. The GPS location for the well. Some of those things are amazing, but it can be difficult to come to what that creative solution or insight might be. Yes. Can you give our leaders out there some advice on how to shift out of their whatever box they might be in to come up with those creative insights or solutions?
I think that organizations are not investing enough in their storytellers, because I think that you're able to show impact and show this breadth of messengers and really sort of hit a lot of the points that I made by funding really smart storytellers. I can't tell you how many clients I work with who do international relief. They have amazing rapid responders on the ground in other countries, but they don't have communications professionals there who are helping tease out the stories, right? And if the organization doesn't know its stories, how can any insights come out of it, right? You know, I know organizations where the rapid response team comes back into the New York office and people just sort of, you know, descend on them to try to get the stories, but it's much different hearing it secondhand than having people who are trained at teasing out stories and emotion on the ground.
But you have to believe that's worthwhile.
You
right?
do, you do. And you know what? Organizations haven't thought that the return on investment is there yet, but as millennials are starting to look for more impact, I think you're going to start seeing shifts there.
So we have a question from Helene who wants to know, how can nonprofits better show the impact of unrestricted funds?
Yeah, you know, I think that's exactly it, right? You need to have storytellers on the ground who are showcasing the breadth and depth of the organization's work and who aren't afraid to talk about individuals, right? A lot of times organizations like to make themselves the protagonists of the story, but that's really sort of counterintuitive, right? You want to make the beneficiaries of the work the protagonists of your story. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen, you know, organizations, you know, talk about their beneficiaries in statistics and lumps rather than this specific person, Sally and her mom, right? Because they're afraid about leading with emotion.
Yeah. And it seems to me part of Helene's question too is sort of this focus on specific events that drive giving or that drive people's behavior rather than sort of constantly thinking about it as a story you're telling.
Absolutely.
In general. Now, when you sort of think about what people don't see when they think about the space, what people have the most wrong, are there some misconceptions or one in particular that you point to, you think if you could change this piece of your mindset, that would make a dramatic difference?
You know, I do, because I don't know how many folks in this room are marketers and communications folks. Can I have a show of hands?
Loud and proud.
Yeah, loud and proud. And how many folks would identify as programs, like heads of programs? Right, okay, so I think we've got more marketers and communicators. Well, one thing I've learned in my role is that there really is a tension between programmatic objectives and communications fundraising objectives, right? Program folks want to be credible, they want to have authority, and that is absolutely a-okay. But there's a tension because they want to lead with the facts, right? And they want to lead talking to Spock. And a lot of times their audiences are Spock, right? But when we're talking about individual giving, our audiences are Homer. So there's a little bit of a translation that has to happen. So I think really one of the key things that we need to do is bridge that divide and get communicators and program people really on the same page and figure out ways that we can achieve both of our objectives.
And it is sort of bringing that whole self idea to the organization as well, right? Because there is this sort of sense that as divisions, you almost function as individual entities rather
Absolutely.
than as a whole one.
I do a take a program officer out to lunch week,
Oh.
right? And what I do is I take program officers out to lunch and I tell them about my challenges as a fundraiser, and I hear about their challenges as program staff. And really, it's one of the most effective hours of my week because I get so much consensus building done. Right.
And that's real outreach, real on-the-ground outreach.
Absolutely.
So we've got about 20 seconds. Give me and the leaders out there your elevator pitch for why making this shift is worth it.
Yep. In order to influence behavior, we really have to understand behavior. And if we're operating in our own sort of la-la land of how we want people to behave, that is not going to have on-the-ground impact. So we have to operate from the realities of how people behave.
Excellent. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Leah.
guys.
So
Thank you so
fascinating.
much. I appreciate it.